If you think about how much wood we use in the country every year, we use about 60 billion board feet. If you were to replace and reuse as much salvage material as possible, basically all of the wood waste we could in this country, you could replace about 58% of that. And so what's happening to that material today is it's ending up on the ground, it's ending up in landfill, it's ending up being burned. And so we're quite literally burning billions and billions and billions of dollars of value every single year. Doesn't make any sense. And so eyes wide open, let's run at this.
Hi folks, I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus and Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. It's been a couple weeks since the Paris Olympics finished up, and I don't know about you, but I've definitely been going through some Olympic withdrawal. I love the games. There's just nothing quite like them. I hardly think about them at all, and then every few years, boom, Olympic fever hits. Partly it's because the Olympics are just so fun. It's a blast getting to see all these incredible feats of athleticism in sports you don't usually get to see on TV. And of course, immediately remembering that you've actually been an expert in them all along. But it's also the spirit of the Olympic Games that always gets me. The way we come together as a global community every couple of years to experience this one thing at the same time. It makes me feel very connected to people all over the world, even though we might not ever meet. And part of what enables that global connection, at the Summer Games especially, is how fundamental and therefore accessible many of the sports are. Don't get me wrong, I love sports like baseball just as much as anyone else. But baseball is complicated. Its rules are arbitrary, shall we say? You need a bunch of gear and a special field to play a real game. It's a high barrier to entry, especially for lower income folks. The Olympics are different. Its contests, at least its most traditional ones, are as basic as it gets. Who can run the fastest, jump the highest, lift the heaviest weight? And that makes them easier for people in any kind of circumstance to get into. You need very little to chase the dream of being an Olympic runner, just the earth to run on and the courage to try. I've been thinking about this a lot recently because the track and field at this year's Games was so especially exciting, in part because of how many beautiful moments of glory there were for countries that don't usually get much or any of the world's spotlight. It was unforgettably thrilling and moving to witness Julian Outford win St. Lucia's first ever Olympic medal with a gold in one of the most prestigious events of all, the women's 100 meters. Or seeing Tamirat Tola set a men's Olympic record in the marathon, winning gold for Ethiopia. Of course, the U.S. did still take the majority of medals, and it doesn't diminish the remarkable achievements and hard work of our athletes to acknowledge that having a National Olympic Committee with substantial resources to support athletes helps a great deal. The results clearly speak for themselves, but they also kind of speak to the fact that it's not everything. The next most successful country in track and field this year, both by gold and overall medal count, was Kenya, a nation whose GDP is currently 270 times smaller than the United States. And while nothing beats the blink and you've missed it excitement of the sprints, it's generally the distance running that you see this kind of parity most at work. I think my biggest takeaway from these games, in fact, is how much I've enjoyed the distance running. I love how level the playing field is, and how the story of those races plays out over time with twists and turns like a novel. It's also at least partially because I seem to be surrounded by distance runners these days. My partner's training for a marathon as we speak, my producer a 10-miler, and one of my best friends an ultra. It's an activity that pushes human beings so far to the limits of what's physically possible, that tests endurance in such extreme ways that it's truly awe-inspiring, and also a little bit terrifying. It's hard to wrap your head around how an activity that seems to be mostly about suffering grabs people in such a profound way. But I think the main thing is that distance running, at its core, is a sport about nothing more than determination. And that means anyone can do it. When I watch Olympic gymnastics, I'm amazed and entertained precisely because I have no illusion that I could ever do anything remotely like that. But when I watch the distance race, I kind of feel motivated, like I could do that. Not as fast as they do, of course, but I could do the same sport at some level. Because distance running, for the non-Olympian anyway, doesn't ask you to be the strongest or the fastest or the most coordinated to succeed. Success in distance running only asks for a single thing, that you keep going. And that's a potent metaphor if ever there was one. It's a powerful way of thinking about our fight against climate change. Anyone can do it, and while each little step might not seem meaningful on its own, if you just keep going and don't stop working, over time it's amazing how much all those steps will add up to. It's also a great way to think about entrepreneurship. If you only train for short-term speed and success, you won't have that sustainable base to carry you through the long miles when things get tough. I mean, there's a good reason it's a marathon, not a sprint, is one of my favorite business speak metaphors. And in the case of my guest today, it's not a metaphor at all. I'm joined on Consensus in Conversation this week by Ben Christensen, who, in addition to being the co-founder and CEO of a very cool sustainable materials company in Cambium, is also a pretty accomplished marathon runner. An ultramarathon runner, actually, which is not why we asked him on the show, but is majorly inspiring and also timely as a lens for thinking about the kind of work we like to spotlight. The reason we did ask him to join is because of the amazing work he's doing with Cambium, pioneering carbon-smart wood as a sustainable and scalable building material. Cambium reclaims fallen or removed trees that would otherwise end up as waste wood off-gassing in landfills and turns that into a unique, locally sourced and carbon-negative material that could help cut global carbon emissions by up to 4%. They've done some beautiful work in partnership with names like Microsoft and Patagonia, and were named one of the world's most innovative companies in 2024 by Fast Company. It was a pleasure having Ben on the podcast to chat about bringing the marathon mindset to building sustainable businesses. So, without further ado, let's get this up and running. Sorry, had to do it. And actually, there's one quick programming note for you before we start. Consensus and Conversation will be taking a short break for Labor Day. That means no episode next Thursday, the 5th of September, but we'll be back after that to our usual schedule starting on September 12th. Thanks for joining today, Ben. Really excited to get a chance to talk to you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I want to start with a little bit about you and your background. I know in other interviews you talked about the way you grew up and kind of how it may have become an inevitable path for you to get into conservation and wood specifically. So it may sound like an offbeat question, but tell me about the role that wood has played in your life.
Yeah, it's played an outsized role, maybe for me more than other folks. Wood has been something that has been a really big connector to family for me. So my dad, construction worker, carpenter, really a big part of our bonding time growing up was spending time in the shop and then also spending time in the woods together. We would walk a lot. Our sort of favorite activity was the walk around, where you walked around. And then we spent summers as I got older salvaging firewood from the forest, spending a lot of time in that space. So it's always been something that's really connected me to my dad. And then the second thing that wood has played, a really big role in my life is it's become the core of our company. So we're focused on transforming how you use material and using a much more sustainable version of wood. And that's been really transformational in my life.
Yeah.
And so as I've zoomed in on that more, it's become a passion. It's become something I've become incredibly curious in, particularly in how the industry, which is this really old historic industry, can get to the next phase. And so it's become something that I think about every single day.
I love the good old walkabout. I'm a big fan of a walkabout. So, you mentioned kind of going outside, spending a lot of time outdoors as a kid. And curious, you were raised in New Mexico, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah. So talk about that, like growing up in New Mexico and the role that your sense of place has in building the career that you've built.
I think that one of the biggest things that I took away from growing up there was this sense of, hey, our climate is changing and changing pretty actively. One of the things that we saw in the early 2000s in New Mexico was a real increase in wildfires and wildfire intensity that was predicated because of increased drought. And so my mom, being a hydrologist, spent a lot of time with her in different parts of the water space, at local meetings and tagging along and just really hearing from her how much things had changed from historic patterns. And so what that really helped instill in me was like, wow, this problem is very real. It's impacting communities today. I'm seeing it happen. I'm seeing it impact the forests around me. And so I knew from a really early age that addressing that was really what my life's work was. And so the sense of place there was one that came with a real sense of stewardship as well, and a feeling of responsibility and a feeling of, hey, I want to spend my time, I want to spend my effort, I want to spend my intellectual capability trying to figure this out and trying to create a sense of effort and movement from a bunch of different people around and solving these problems.
Yeah. And just thinking back to your school days, I know there's one other kind of really strong link to what you're doing now, which is you've been friends with your co-founder, Theo Hooker, since you guys were like kids together, right?
Yep.
So how did you guys meet? How did you meet your co-founder?
Yeah. So technically we met when we were 9. We were at
That's amazing.
the same soccer tryout, which is the first memory we have of each other. But really, we went to middle school and high school together, spent a lot of time in high school doing a lot of backpacking. We spent a ton of time outdoors in lots of different crazy environments where we learned a lot about each other and how you work together, how you make decisions together. So we've really built this pretty strong framework and relationship around, all right, you're in a hard place. You've got limited information. Maybe you're not feeling your best because you haven't eaten or, the weather's terrible. How do you still make really good decisions? And that's turned out to be very helpful in running a business together.
It's probably one of the rare co-founder stories that anyone's had too, like having that depth and longitude of relationship.
Yeah, it's pretty unique. I think the other thing that's pretty unique with it is I'd love to see another pair of co-founders who have covered more miles than we have.
That's going to be my next question. Yeah.
We do a lot of ultra running. We've done a lot of distance backpacking together. And so all of that time is time that we're spending thinking about the business, talking about it, really processing, and then also really building the foundation for that decision making that we bring.
Yeah. So when and how did Theo get you into ultra running?
So technically, I got Theo into ultra running. So
okay, sorry,
got
that backwards.
You can ask him; he might give you a different answer. But we really started doing it in the last few years. We started kind of running our first marathon, and then we did our first 50 miler during COVID, and it was one of those things where you run 50 miles and you think, there's no way I could go another mile, let alone another 15 or 20. And then you do 100K and you're like, oh, wow. Okay. Like no way I could go further. And then we did 100 miler. And, it's one of the things that I think has been one of the capital L lessons from running is that if you pick your goal, you might not make it that far, but you're never going to make it further. And so one of the things we try to do really ambitiously in our work, and then also in the impact we try to create, is we try to be really optimistic and bold with our goal setting, because running has certainly taught us that you go exactly as far as you think you can pretty much every time. And if you keep dreaming bigger and you put in the work and you get things right, then you can usually go a lot further.
Yeah. It feels like ultra is having a moment. I feel like I've all of a sudden know a lot of people that are getting into ultra, and it's like impressive, and I can't quite wrap my head around it.
It definitely is having a moment. It's interesting. I actually technically ran my first ultra race when I was 13 in the Grand Canyon, but I had no idea. And the guy who I ran it with, who I still run with all the time, we just didn't even know what ultra running was, or that there was a community around it. And at that time, it was much smaller. It was this really sort of sub niche of people who are going out. Now it's become really popular, and I think it's cool. I think a lot of people are seeing that the type of emotional experience you get from going through something for that long of a time is very different than the type of, physical and emotional experience you get from something like a marathon, which is going to be, 3 to 5 hours maybe. And not to detract or say that that isn't incredibly difficult. It's just a very different experience when you do it for 24 hours or for 6 days, right? And you're in that space, and you start to learn so much more about yourself by just having more time in that space.
It also feels like a place where it's easy to understand or have an appreciation for a communion with nature. I'm curious, how do you understand or appreciate the crossover between the work you do every day and this passion for ultra?
Sure. It's super connected. And, I'll give you a tangible example. So one of the things that I really like to do, Theo and I do this before every race, but we set a mantra, something that we're going to draw on, pull on, is going to kind of be the theme of what we're running on. And for my 100 miler last year in Utah, the mantra was joy in darkness. And one of the big things that you feel when you run 100 miles is you feel bad. There's some real moments of feeling really bad. And what we are really focused on and interested in is all right, you're feeling bad. How can you find as much joy as possible? And when you're doing that in a natural setting, a lot about that is observing, it's being curious. It's having a beginner's mind when you're approaching a new turn or a new rock formation, whatever it is. You just have choices so often in terms of how you see the world. And nature is one of those things that's really all around us. And we can either choose to see it and be a part of it rather than being apart from it if you're intentional.
I love that. Back when you and Thea were in like middle school, high school, did you see the writing on the wall that you two would be entrepreneurial business partners someday? Was it ever you guys were like, I don't know, running an eBay store back when you were in 10th grade or anything? Like any hints at it?
I think that there were some hints for sure. We were always talking about it. We were always sort of starting and running different things. We found some great notes from a drive we did to Colorado where we had come up with like 50 different business ideas. Most of them were pretty crazy and wild. Our challenge was that we just weren't in the same place. And so when we were in college, we went to different places. And so we weren't close. So we never ended up starting any of those, but definitely a lot of hints that we were always thinking about it.
Do any of those ideas, thinking back, stand out as like particularly amusing or, gosh, I wonder if anyone ever did that, or, gosh, that was a terrible idea?
I think this is a perfectly mediocre idea. I actually think it still holds up in terms of the like intention of it. I don't think it holds up as a business, but I'm a big hater of front lawns. I think they are such a wasted space. And when you think about community and like what you try to build in most of suburban America, the front lawn, some places it's used, but generally it's just a nothing space. Nobody spends time there. Nobody gets any value out of it. It's purely aesthetic, but it's not like it couldn't be aesthetic and also functional. And so we had this idea of a front lawn gardening service that essentially you would actively grow in people's front lawns, and then you would split sort of like harvest with them. I think it's an interesting way to think about using space. I don't think it's a, big monetizable business, but I think it's something that more from like a community-centered perspective or a nonprofit perspective, there's some legs there.
I love that. So you mentioned that you weren't able to activate on any of these ideas because you were in different places. You go off to Cal Poly for undergrad and then Yale to study forestry, which I love that Yale has a forestry program. That's like the best fun fact of the day. But what was that experience like? What is the Yale forestry program like? What does that graduate program entail?
Yeah, Yale Forestry is the oldest forest school in the country. So it's the original one that was founded by Pinchot, who's the founder of the Forest Service as well. So it's actually been around for forever. And, it's pretty amazing to see how many different thinkers, people who, really have impacted our natural landscape in the US and more broadly went there. So it's really cool to be in a place that had so much history and exploration. For me, I was in a program that was focused on natural climate solutions, so thinking about how do we actually take a bunch of these sort of ecosystem approaches and address climate change, and was coming out of a pretty technical undergrad in more of the science side. And so I ended up spending a lot of my time at Yale really focused on how do you create scalability within those solutions. So that was learning about policy solutions and then also really on the business side. So I ended up spending a lot of time in a lot of different places, which was amazing. And what it really allowed me to do once I started working on Cambium during grad school was be very selective and kind of be tapping in, all right, hey, we're very interested in the carbon dynamics of, forestry. Let's take this forest carbon seminar and learn about the technical methodologies for how you explore this. And so it allowed me to build a program that really matched the company. And it's pretty lucky, I think, in many ways. I felt very fortunate to be able to be starting something and then think, oh, I really have this as a gap. Let me go take a class, in a way that can really fill that gap for me.
Yeah. And it feels like natural climate solutions itself has had a lot of good traction, a lot of support on the policy side. I'm curious, kind of give us your take on the idea of natural climate solutions as part of the big, broad landscape of all the things that are happening to address the changing climate, just at a high level.
Yeah, big time. I mean, there's been a really big shift in terms of interest into these solutions since 2020, really. It was something that a lot of different people were working on, but it was less of the mainstream climate solution. And I think more broadly, it's pretty hard when you think about addressing climate change to ever say this is the solution. And I think that type of thinking is just generally wrong and not something we should spend our time on. And there's been growing recognition that what is really needed is the kitchen sink approach. Because the reality of pretty much every climate solution is it works well in some contexts and it works poorly in others. And so what you want is you want to take that tranche of the places where it works well from kind of all of the different solutions and piece together a holistic solution that works really well. So natural climate solutions are a big part of that. there's been a lot of growth, both thinking about how do we improve natural climate solutions within existing agriculture, which is a really big part of it. A lot of it when you think about forests and tree planting, and then a lot of it more and more when you think about blue carbon. So the actual carbon cycle within our oceans is a massive carbon sink and can also be a really big carbon emitter. And so making sure that we're thinking holistically there is, I think, the growing consensus within the community.
Yeah. So you mentioned being able to fill gaps and your understanding and in your business plan as you're in this program. It sounds like there's one final piece, which is you also found your third founding partner there, Marissa Repka. So how did you guys first meet? And then how did you kind of coalesce those two into a team of the three of you to build this business?
Marissa and I lived on the same street, so we were very proximate to each other, and we ended up taking a lot of the same classes, had very similar interests, which were particularly aligned on how do you create financially scalable solutions for climate change. And so we ended up doing a lot of work together. And I think one of the things that proved to be really valuable is spending a lot of time in very rigorous classes allowed us to learn how we work, how we communicate, how we can approach challenging problems together. We also learned that we got along really well. We played soccer together, which is something that Theo and I also did. And so shared some of these sort of like outside of academia bonds that enabled us to just like have fun, which I think is something that's really important when you're thinking about these relationships that ultimately define businesses is, can you have a good time with them? Because again, to that point of finding joy in the darkness, like there's a lot of darkness in building a company. There's a lot of hard moments. And you're either with people who are going to make that worse or who are going to make it better. Yeah. And so Marissa is really one of those. She's got a really great mindset and a great approach. And I learned that in our first sort of couple of years together. And Marissa, was somebody who I was very keen to join, in particular because Marissa is very different from me in how she thinks and how she operates, which is amazing because she does a lot of things way, way better than I do. And I recognize that and was really trying to push on, hey, this is somebody who can create a ton of value because they can think differently, they can approach risk differently, they can take on different roles within the company very differently. And so eventually convinced her to jump on board. And we had, Theo on board as well. And it was one of those things where it really started to coalesce. And, you can't look back at history and be too revisionist, but I think COVID actually impacted that in some really big ways because COVID then put us all in Albuquerque for the start of sort of going full time on the business. And so we were all close. We're all very focused on it. And that allowed us to go from sort of, all right, here's a project we're working on in grad school to, okay, this is becoming a company and we're starting to see real traction and we're taking it seriously in our own lives like that as well.
So let's start with that. Let's jump in and hear the origin story. What was the aha moment that unlocked not just the idea of carbon smart wood, but the idea that convinced you that this was, potentially a scalable business model?
So the initial idea that I was running with was I was looking at all this money coming into trees. Trees were having a real moment in 2019 and 2020. There was a bunch of new analysis about reforestation and the Trillion Trees movement was sort of happening. And There's a lot of sort of complexity that's settled out then. But at that point, it was like really exciting. And the big thing I was recognizing was that the way that we plant trees, which are a great way to store carbon, is primarily funded either through governments or through nonprofits, right? It's important work, but there's no real financial systems that tie consistent revenues to consistent plantings. And so that was where the idea initially started for me. I had several different ways that I approached that, but over time recognized that they weren't the best ideas. Would sort of have an idea, hit a wall, try something else, and eventually stumbled upon this problem of wasted wood. I was at a conference and saw a presentation and was like, wow, this is way bigger than I had ever expected. And to what we were talking about earlier, wood has always played a big role in my life, but I didn't have sort of an intuition about how big the problem of wood waste was. And when I heard that, I was like, oh, if you could capture that waste and you could turn it into something valuable, you could make a ton of money. And if you could do that in a way that actually connects the making of that money into the creating of circular and regenerative systems, you can do something really good with it as well. And so that was kind of the initial aha moment that was like, oh, let's really zoom in on this and start building towards figuring out how we could solve the wood waste problem in the US.
Do you have a sense for folks of how to quantify that for the layperson, like how big the wood waste problem is?
Yeah. So the way to think about that is, if you think about how much wood we use in the country every year, we use about 60 billion board feet. So a board foot is just 1 foot by 1 foot and 1 inch thick. We use that material for lots and lots of different things. So we use about 60 billion board feet of this every year. If you were to replace and reuse as much salvage material as possible, so if we basically used all of the wood waste we could in this country, you could replace about 58% of that. So we could reduce almost half of our consumption going from cutting down trees that, builds buildings, flooring, and furniture with material that's already being wasted. And so what's happening to that material today is it's ending up on the ground, it's ending up in landfill, it's ending up being burned. And so we're quite literally burning, billions and billions and billions of dollars of value every single year. Doesn't make any sense. And so that's the problem that really, eyes wide open, let's run at this.
So let's talk about the idea of this carbon smart wood specifically then. What makes the most sustainable method or wood product as a material?
So carbon smart wood is wood that comes from material that was not going to be harvested. And so it's material that's coming down anyway in and around our cities. So just to make that a little more tangible, if you think about trees in parks or trees on city streets, they're living things. When they die or get close to dying, we take them down. That's part of managing them safely so they don't fall on somebody's house, right? And we also see lots of material come down because of pests or during natural disasters, hurricanes, ice storms, those kinds of things lead to lots and lots of material waste. And then the final one that really drives it is development. When we build new buildings, when our cities continue to expand to house our communities, we end up cutting down a lot of material. And so what carbon smart wood does is it helps salvage that material. And instead of sending it to the waste stream, we sort of interject and we start turning it into a much more usable material. So the first thing that's really important there is that it's salvaged. You're keeping that carbon inside the wood instead of, spreading it out into little pieces and letting it off gas back into the atmosphere like you do with mulch. The second thing is that it's processed locally. So we're really building out these local processing economies. One of the things that we've done in America is we've shipped a lot of our manufacturing jobs overseas. We're all about helping to bring those back in and around our cities. And so really focus on local processing. And then the final goal here is also to really sell that material as locally as possible. So reduce the transportation emissions that are associated with traditional forestry, where you're shipping wood across oceans all the time, and you're actually able to do that really locally.
And how do you, again, this is for the layperson, how do you talk them through moving from that preliminary salvage stream into something that you would then, purchase in the economy? Walk us through kind of the real simple completion of the cycle.
Yeah, the way you get wood in your home is somebody has to source that material. Somebody has to take that log and turn it into a board. Somebody has to take that board and turn it into a dry board. And then somebody takes that board and they turn it into whatever you're going to bring in. So let's just say a table. For us, what we are really building is we're building out the connectivity and all of these local supply chains to actually be able to do that and do that at scale. And so one of the things that we talk about a lot is historically, if you have a house from the 1800s, right, you're going to have pretty much wood that was all super local, right? It was cut locally, it was dried locally, it went into the house. And what we've moved away from is then we've moved to these giant globalized hyper-industrial supply chains. And the reason we've really done that is because of cost, because when you do things really at scale, you get better pricing. But what we're seeing is that because we're able to utilize a waste stream and because we're using our technology to create a ton of efficiencies in production, we can really compete on cost. And so what we're building is the supply chain that can produce locally in the same ways that it used to, but also create the scale that a much larger company can produce as well.
And it seems like, this is one of a handful of companies in the kind of space that really is, the finance folks are excited about. I spent 10 plus years as an investment banker, and I keep a finger on the pulse of where capital's going, or people are talking about the capital market spaces. And we've heard repeatedly that this idea that the next unicorns are all coming from climate tech. But I'm curious, as someone who is maybe in a non-traditional lane when it comes to climate tech, how the financial markets have received this idea. And let's just start with that.
Sure. I mean, you're spot on. Most people don't really think about wood that much. It's truly all around us. It's in every building. It's in pretty much every piece of furniture. It's underneath our feet 90% of the times when we're inside. So it's everywhere. But most people don't think about it. And, that's one of the things that I think is both a challenge sometimes when we're talking to folks. They don't really understand it or they don't think about it. It's also a big advantage, right? It's a massive market. It's a $215 billion market in the US, $750 billion globally. It's going to 3x by 2050. So it's growing really fast. And all of that means there's a lot of space for innovation and there's a big gap in it. When you think about the actual type of software, when you think about the type of investment that's coming into the space, a lot of it is overlooking these traditional industries. And so for us, we're really focused, and we see this resonate with investors a lot, on sort of two key messages. One is that we're bringing technology to a space that is very fragmented and doesn't have any sort of connected platform technology. That is something that has been done in lots of different spaces, and we're here to do it for wood. And then the second thing on the climate tech side is one of the things that is challenging about a lot of climate tech companies is they have to really develop both the solution from a hard tech perspective and the market for it, or it's very reliant on like the voluntary carbon market. For us, we've got a very big established market where we're selling material that plugs directly into existing demand. And from a technical perspective, we don't have to create some new machine. You don't have to create a robot to do this. You're able to do it with existing technology. And so you can scale it really fast. And so that's the big thing that we're pushing is the path to scale is there and using technology to transform a legacy industry. Generally, we get a lot of excitement. We've raised about 10 million to date. We've got a lot more coming in soon.
I also think it's interesting. You think about this legacy space, for a long time, kind of the forestry space, I feel like didn't necessarily have the same amount of attention in terms of impact analysis in climate as carbon did. Everyone was always talking about carbon, right? Even though, obviously the two are deeply related, but it felt like land use wasn't necessarily a top folks impact radar. And I know you've done some work with folks at WRI and the World Resource Institute. I'm just kind of curious from your perspective, if you think that gap is closing too, if the philanthropic investors are also seeing this now as a place to be really conscientious and thoughtful, and how that evolution's going.
I think that there's been a really big shift. Obviously, I don't have a ubiquitous understanding of everybody, but I think I've really noticed a big shift, particularly among peers and folks in the scientific community, where I feel like 10 years ago, there was a decent amount of people who thought of themselves as, foresters or conservationists. And, there's a small niche who then considered carbon in their work. Now, you can't separate those two. And the big reasons for that are obviously the pressing moment and the need to address it. But it's also really because the funding dynamics have shifted, right? Pretty much if you're going to get funded in any way for a conservation project or for a ecosystem services project, you are going to be actively considering, monitoring, and optimizing for carbon storage within that. You might have other variables, but now it's kind of table stakes that you have to evaluate that and you have to be up to speed on it. And so huge shift in that space for sure.
As you kind of are now in the scaling process, what are you guys thinking about in terms of growth on both the impact side and the ROI side? How are you thinking about growing into having the biggest impact economically and from a social and cultural and environmental perspective?
I think we think about two things really intensely. The first, and this is part of the learning that comes from ultra running, but you only run really far if you are incredibly disciplined in all of the small ways, right? So when you're running 100 miles, what you're eating at mile 12 and your hydration levels at mile 29 are critical for how you feel at mile 80 and if you're going to be able to continue. And so one of the things that we are very focused on is our internal processes in terms of how do we get our internal team incredibly dialed, focused, and executing really well so that we can actually create scale. Because as we know, when you add in more complexity into organizations, lots of them start to struggle. They start to fail to grow. And oftentimes that's not connected to a bad idea or a non-scalable idea. It's connected to they didn't build the organizational processes to actually get to scale. So classic quote, but we really focus and believe that you fall to the level of your systems, you don't rise to the level of your goals. And so we try to make that something really inherent. And then the other thing when we think about scaling, so we are focused first, obviously, on how do you save wood from landfill and mulch at scale. We really see a ton of potential there. We think we can get to $1 billion in revenue there over time. And so we're focused on that. But we're also starting to scale into helping create transparency and better sustainable decision making across all wood. And so that's sort of our next step. And then longer term, moving into all materials. So our thesis is that somebody who is purchasing materials at scale wants a sustainable option as possible, and they want full transparency to believe that that material is actually sourced really sustainably. And so we're very focused on building that bottom-up data layer for green building. Doing that ubiquitously can create massive gigaton scale impact, across the built environment globally. And that's what we're going after.
I mean, even in the immediate term, it's certainly proving out. You've got some great partnerships with some of the biggest companies, brands out there. So I'm curious to hear about those partnerships and kind of what you're doing and learning from your work with Microsoft, Patagonia, others.
Yeah, we've learned a lot. We are really excited and have shown, that this material can be used, that it's the same as a lot of traditional materials, and that you can use it in lots of different ways. So, our partnerships with National Geographic and Microsoft are really about highlighting it in corporate offices, right? You can use this material in ways that are connected into the executive team, and they're seeing the material and they're thinking about circularity. We've done it in, retail with Patagonia and with a couple other new partners who we're launching with. We've done it with furniture, with room and board and Steelcase. We've done it with big architecture firms like CBRE and Gensler. And so what we're really trying to show is that this material works in lots of different ways. There's lots of different use cases for it. Our supply chains can fulfill those. First, we were demonstrating that they could fulfill them, right? We're demonstrating we can get products into market. And now we're really at the point where we've showed that. And now we're really showing that we can scale that. So starting to build, much bigger buildings out of that with a very big focus on mass timber. So actually building the walls and the structural elements of buildings from our wood as well.
We're recording this the first week of the Olympics, Summer Olympics. I did notice a great story. I think it was in Architectural Digest this week on the only new construction that they built for the Olympics was the pool pavilion. There's a whole story about the wood that they've used for that, which is really a cool story for folks. Maybe we'll put in the show notes. Let's talk. Actually, hearing about some of those examples, I think is a really good opportunity to dig in a little bit more and help folks understand this notion that you can take wood that others may have thought was just discardable and create high quality, high impact product. Some of the names that you just dropped, these are high-end partners. Help people understand how products that, some may think died in a disaster or through disease, how they're still perfectly usable, super high-quality products. Is that part of the sale? I guess the sales pitch to partners, and how is that sales pitch laid out? Because it's such a great reminder that there's such value in things if you know how to think about it differently or how to look at it differently or how to break it down differently.
For sure. I think there's two big parts of it. The first is a little bit more existential, which I think about a lot. And I think this is something we've kind of gotten wrong as a human race, is we've just been optimizing for sameness. We want everything to look exactly the same, always. And we end up just kind of removing the soul or intrigue into anything. If you go to IKEA, there's hundreds of thousands of the exact same looking thing that's all the same. It's the same. But that's not actually who humans are, right? We care about stories. We care about being unique. We are interested in things that have a history. Just think about, all right, you've got people in your house. What is the one object you're going to tell them about? You're not going to tell them about something that looks exactly the same as everything else that you got on the shelf at Target. You're going to tell them about your grandfather's kitchen table, or you got this cedar chest during some travel or whatever it is. You're going to tell them about something with a story. And I really fundamentally believe that people care about products differently when they know their stories behind them. And so when we actually focus on that, what we're trying to do is trying to create the same scale of the sort of sameness economy, but with the power of story and a focus on uniqueness. And so what that is that's really brand education on, hey, we are using waste material, right? This is a waste stream. This is not going and clear cutting forests where you're getting exactly the perfect log every single time. And then you're, wasting a lot of it in the process in order to get these perfect boards. we're very focused on we are taking what we get and we're processing it in ways where it might look a little bit more unique. There's more character, it might have a different piece, but that's actually something that we want, right? You actually
Yeah.
want to be able to say, yo, look at this table I got. Like, it's amazing. It came from this place. This person built it along the way. It came from the tree that my parents got married under, or, it came from the city that I grew up in, whatever it is, there's places and ways to change that perception. And so we really focus on that. I think the other thing that we often think about too, and we say all the time, is come see the wood. Like, it's easy to start thinking like, oh, this is a waste material, or, how would you ever transform something from hurricanes into usable material? It's like, come look. We were always happy to have anybody at our R&D center in between DC and Baltimore. We have tons of examples. We share samples very broadly with folks in the architecture and design community. And then when they see it, they're like, wow, amazing. It works. And so we're always really excited to get people to actually get hands on wood.
That's awesome. When we first spoke, you mentioned something that I think is really interesting and compelling, which is, you've got this underlying tension between the purpose-driven mission and, a business's need for growth. And in order to accomplish real impact at scale, how you think about and balance those decisions affects what you're going to do day to day. So I want to dig in a little bit on that and have you talk to us about finding the right balance and finding the right process to help drive impact, drive purpose, and build a business that scales. It's something that we talk about all the time on this show.
Yeah, there's inherent tension there, but I also think oftentimes when there's tension like that, it leads to the best type of innovation. And so we try to be very aware of our goal is impact at scale over time, and we don't want to have to compromise on our way to that sort of scale. But we also are very aware that we're not going to get everything right the first round. We're not going to get everything right the second round. Like, it's going to take us a lot of time to build a new supply chain that is fully regenerative and is really, really equitable. And so something that I find the environmental movement often has, which is a good intuition, but I think it also undercuts a lot of efforts, is people can be so focused on, hey, this isn't perfect, we shouldn't do it. And the problem is you can find problems with literally everything. Every single business has a problem. Every single environmental solution has a problem. There's no silver bullets. Nothing is perfect. And the question I think we should really be asking ourselves is, can this get to a significantly better state? And does it have a path to keep going in that direction? And so we think about that all the time as a business, where I'll give you a tangible example. Our goal is to ultimately have source material, processing, and delivery all within 100 miles. So somebody is buying a product at the end of the day that was turned into that product locally and was processed locally. That just doesn't exist from an infrastructure perspective across the US. And so if we were going to say, all right, we're going to start there, we would be starting so small in a way that's not scalable and not replicable, because we'd be working in 3 supply chains in the US. But if we start saying, hey, it's way better just inherently to use salvaged wood versus traditional wood, and even if you ship it the same amount, it's still way better, right? And then that's now allowed us to get to scale. And now we're starting to work with the big partners, and we're able to start reducing those shipping distances. And we're able to start creating more and more of those processors to allow for local processing. And so that's the kind of thinking that we end up doing. And we're big believers that push to scale, but don't compromise along the way.
Well, and it is a good reminder, small changes that have positive impact, even if they're not perfect impact and perfect changes, still move us in the right direction. And that's, especially at this moment in time, critical. I'm a big believer that it's much easier to pivot, to grow, to expand when you're already moving than it is to start from scratch and, do all those things perfectly correctly right away.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the things that we get wrong a lot as business leaders, politically. I think politicians do this all the time, is they present things as sort of just like, this is great. This is a perfect policy, or this is a perfect business solution. And it's just not true. That just doesn't exist. The world is so complex and everything has trade-offs. And so when you present that way, then you're constantly creating this sort of idea and mythology that leaves people feeling underwhelmed or feeling deceived or feeling like we're not actually making progress. And I think that instead, and I really believe this in the environmental climate movement, is hey, this is much better than what we are doing. It's not perfect. And like, we've got more work to do. We're going to have to get to the next phase. But if you focus on that a little bit more, I think it changes how people think and how they receive these ideas.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who's a founder in kind of the space with a keen awareness of what else is going on, I'm curious, what other innovations or fields of research in climate tech and sustainability you've got your eye on? What's exciting you? What do you think is happening in the next big breakthrough around the corner?
I think that there's a lot of really exciting movement in the blue carbon space. There's a number of different solutions that are starting to think about oceans as something that we've always thought about generally as like passively managed, and starting to think about those as more actively managed. If you think about trees, like in the US, most of our forests, somebody is thinking about, is it healthy? How are we improving the ecosystem? How are we actively playing a role in that? For the ocean, which is a completely different beast with a lot of different variables, different dynamics, it's much harder, but there's lots of ways to do that. And so I'm really bullish on a lot of these new sort of blue carbon solutions, things that are thinking about more sustainable fisheries, things that are thinking about more sustainable growth of materials and actually creating, an actively managed ocean in ways that are really prioritizing ecosystems as well, but starting to play more of a role. Because what happens if we don't actively manage them, then we are just passively managing them by overfishing and introducing a ton of carbonic acid into our oceans through carbon dioxide and resulting in ocean acidification. So if we don't start actively managing them, we are pushing them in other ways.
You use the phrase that you're really bullish on those new ideas and that work in that space. I love the reality that you're bullish on something in the climate space, because I think I am too, but I get to have conversations like this all the time and talk to really interesting folks who are doing cool work and building cool businesses. I think a lot of folks, it's easy to read the headlines and get depressed or get overwhelmed by the scale of the solution that we're going to need, the size of the problem that we face. I'm curious how you remain bullish in general. And, because I think it's critical when you're leading an organization in this space to have that kind of optimism and hope. So how do you go about defeating defeatism? How do you suggest, folks on your team or folks in your life to stay bullish and to stay hopeful on the impact that your work or our collective work can do?
Yeah, something I think about a lot. I think it requires attention and it requires vigilance. When I was in college, there was a talk that I had gone to. I sort of brought this group of other students that I was leading to this talk on climate. And this author gave this talk about climate change and how bad it was. And essentially his whole takeaway was, look, we're probably not going to solve it. You should basically hunker down, like super defeatist. And I have some moments of passion in my life, but I was so like activated by that because he was telling this group of young people, like, look, kind of quit. And, I got up and I was pushing back on him, and was basically saying, like, if we take that position, like, oh, it's a choice to get to go and like move to your little farm and do some, sustainable agriculture and pick a place that's climate resilient and kind of just hunker down. That is such a privileged choice. And I think that for people who are able to make that choice, you have way more responsibility than I think we're often aware of. And so what I try to stay really connected to is I feel very responsible. I think that for all of us, particularly in the Western world, particularly for folks who really have access to so many more resources than lots of people globally, we have to be really leading and being very active there. And so I think when you come back to this core question of why, which is something tying it all back into ultra, but one of the most important things when you're doing something for a long time, like running hundreds of miles or addressing climate change over a lifetime, you have to be able to answer why. And you have to be able to answer why in lots of different ways. And one of the biggest ones for me right now is because we have to. It's like a duty. It's a responsibility. It's not something that, oh, you're a little tired or bummed. It's like we only get to this future state we want if we believe it's possible and we work together in ways that feel audacious and collective and are really holistic. If we don't do that, shame on us, right? It's not like, oh, damn, we missed it. It's like, no, we should be, I think, viewing it that way more and more. And so, again, not from a downside perspective, but more from like, yeah, let's rally around this responsibility. Let's be excited about it. Let's take responsibility for this thing that we've created and deal with it.
Yeah. I mean, when you think about kind of the impact you specifically hope to make, your answer to that question, your answer to that why. If you were to close your eyes and picture the biggest success you could possibly imagine, what's the scale of change you want to say you have achieved? What do you wish your legacy to be?
Yeah, I mean, when I think about this, I think about sort of two moments. I think about global carbon negativity 2065. I think that's something that we have to be shooting for, where we have actively tipped the carbon cycle and we're running the odometer backwards. And so focusing and doing everything that we can to get there. And then the second is, I think about 2100, right? And this is this moment where we're sort of at the fleeting, ephemeral start to a new millennia, right? We're in 2024 here. And what do the next 1,000 years look like? How do we start the first of those 10, 100-year sprints really, really well? And are we going to spend the next 900 years of this millennia undoing the sort of like missed opportunities from this century and the last century? Or are we going to be in a place where we get to focus on what humanity is actually about, which is like creating and building and exploring and creating art and doing beautiful things? Or are we going to have to spend the whole time like dealing with this problem? And to me, the goal that I really want to see in my life, and I think so many other people want to see, is the 2100 where, a lifetime doesn't need to be spent on climate change, right? Where kids who are born in that era get to spend their time and do their life's work on things that are not related to this problem and have the freedom to do that and really have that in ubiquitous ways. So those are the two moments I think about and really want to see that on the millennial scale.
I love that. For folks that want to learn more, where can we send them to hear more from you, read more from you, check out the products, check out the company? Where do you want to go?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can check out carbonsmart.com, pretty easy to remember, which will connect you into the Cambium website where you can learn a lot more about what we build. And I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So any listeners want to connect, chat, I always answer my DMs there. So feel free, always looking to connect with folks in the space and here to help.
Awesome. We'll put all of it in the show notes. Thank you so much for taking the time today. What an inspiring conversation, and particularly, I think folks, they'll feel the energy, they'll feel that motivation that you put out there. So
thank you.
Huge thanks to Ben Christensen for joining us today on Consensus in Conversation. As Ben mentioned, you can find out more about the topics discussed today on carbonsmart.com, where you can also find links to Cambium's site. You can also connect with Ben on LinkedIn, send him a message if you want to learn more about his work. We'll have all the links for you in the show notes to connect directly. As always, you can email us at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. You can also message me directly on LinkedIn or Threads at ckgaughan. That's at ckgaughan. Send us your questions, comments, ideas for future guests. We love the feedback. If you've enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It's so helpful with growing our reach and adding new people to the conversation. And it helps us continue bringing you more awesome talks with the business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. As a reminder, we're off for Labor Day next week, so here's hoping everyone has a very happy end of summer holiday. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new conversation. See you September 12th. Consensus in Conversation is hosted by me, Conor Gaughan, and executive produced by me and Jeff Rock. Our producer is Will Gatchell, with editing by the team at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker and Greg Harrigal on research. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.